With the help of Hashem, we are learning Megila Daf Yud. We left off on Daf Tes Amid Beis, the second to last Mishnah before the bottom of the Amid, which is 11 lines before the bottom of the Amid. We are concluding in today's Daf the series of Ein Bains. The final two will be first Ein Bain Bama Gedola LaBama Ketana. We're going to be speaking about the time that there was a Heter Bamais, the time of the Isur Bamais, as we'll explain in a moment. We're going to have the final Ein Bain Shiloi LiYerushalayim. As we know, the Mishkan Shiloi stood there for 369 years, and as it was in the desert, so in Mishkan Shiloi, this was a bona fide Mishkan, as we'll explain why the Mishkan in Shiloi was considered a greater Mishkan than the one in Gilgal, than the one in Noiv, than the one in Gidoin. And which that's going to lead us into this whole topic of Kedusha Rishoina, the initial sanctification that was made both when we entered Eretz Yisrael, then again when we entered Eretz Yisrael under the leadership of Ezra. Do we say Kitsha L'Shaita? It had an effect to sanctify, as we'll speak about Yerushalayim, another similar topic, the rest of Eretz Yisrael, but V'loi Kitsha L'Asad Lavai, but it did not create a sanctification that stays forever, meaning that when there is a Churban, as there was through Rome, that sanctification is not there anymore? Or do we say, Kedusha Rishoina, not only Kitsha L'Shaita, not only did it sanctify that part of Eretz Yisrael at that time, but yes, Kitsha L'Asid Lavai, and we'll explain how this will affect, amongst many other things, whether now on Harabayis do we have the halachic Kedusha of the Beis HaMikdash, so paskins the Rambam, which would mean, amongst other things, that if someone goes there, if they're not pure, they're going to, God forbid, be chayiv kares, or as the other paskin, like the Ravid, that Kedusha Rishoina Kitsha L'Shaita V'loi Kitsha L'Asad Lavai. So if a person is going to go on top of Temple Mount and they're going to go into areas where you have to go there only bitara, they won't be chayiv kares. And this is a very, very important topic, and we'll do the best we could to speak about it as we go through the sugya. This is going to be basically the final topic before the rest of the Perek. The rest of the Perek, which means from Yud Amid Beis until Daf Yud Zayin, we're going to be learning Pshatim in Megillah Esther. Firstly, we're going to have a record of how many Amoraim would open up their drashas regarding Megillah Esther, and all of their drashas was based on that which we learned on Daf Zayin, that Esther was the one that asked of the Chachamim, Kisfuni L'Doiris, institute, put Megillah Esther in the Tanach, and there was obviously some hesitation. So all of the Amoraim would open up their drashas regarding Megillah Esther, showing how you have a pasuk or more in the rest of Tanach, whether it is in Torah, whether it is in Nevi'im, that is already alluding to the miracle of Purim. And they would link it to a pasuk recorded prior in the Holy Scripture to show why and to explain why Megillah Esther should be part of Tanach, because you have references about this miracle already, whether it is in Chumash, whether it is in Nevi'im, and then we're going to start, Pashat is speaking about different drashas, literally going through the entire Megillah, and again that's going to continue not only on Daf Yud Aleph, but it's going to go mamish until the end of the Perek. Okay, so now to begin today's shiur regarding Bama, coming back to Daf Tes Amid Beis, the word Bama means a platform. One of the most important ways that a Yid is able to connect to God Almighty is through the offering of a sacrifice. Most of the sacrifices were animal sacrifices. Don't forget there were also flour sacrifices. There was also what we call libations, which is pouring on the Mizbeach wine. During Sukkot we would pour on the Mizbeach water. But all of this falls into the category of the human being striving to get closer to God by offering a korban, a sacrifice, with all of the beautiful insights, as we have in Chassidus, that we have to, so to say, sacrifice the animal, which will allow the godly to come closer to God Almighty. Where can a person bring a sacrifice? So let's say like this, that from when we were gifted by God the tablets, the luchos, and they are placed in a holy ark, in the Aron Kodesh. When the Aron Kodesh has a proper resting place, which is either in the Mishkan or in the Mikdash, during that period of time, a Jew may not bring a carbon anywhere other than in the altar that it's in that compound. And indeed, during the 40 years we were in the desert, I know not the entire 40 years, but from when we built the Mizbeach, from when we built the Mishkan, until when we moved into Eretz Yisrael, even though we were traversing through the desert, so it's not that it was fixed in one location, but whenever the Mishkan settled, the Aron HaKodesh was placed in it in a permanent way, and therefore that Mishkan had the highest level of the Kedusha of the Mishkan, which gave the altar the status of a Mizbeach, and when we have a Mizbeach, one may not offer a carbon on any other built platform other than the Mizbeach. And that's called that during the 40 years, it was usher to offer a carbon on a bama. Now, when we entered Eretz Yisrael under the leadership of Yehoshua, for the first 14 years, as we should know, it took us 7 years to properly conquer the entire land at that time. There was still more to be conquered, but there was a 7 year of conquest. Then there was a 7 year of settling. During those total of 14 years, the Mishkan stood in Gilgal. However, the Aron HaKodesh would go out to battle with the Jewish people. I know this is a very important topic, and we learned in Shkolim that there were really two Aron Kodesh, there were two Aronos, which one went out, which one didn't go out. I know that this is all linked together, but let's follow the approach that when the Mishkan was not considered permanent, it had a lesser amount of Kedusha. We didn't even call the Mizbeach in the Mishkan Mizbeach. We called it either a Bama Gedoyla, the major Bama, or we called it Bamas Tzibur. During that time, one was allowed to build a platform in any place that they wanted and to offer a limited type of sacrifices, which will be the first topic that we'll be learning about today. That's called the time of Heter Bamais. You were allowed to bring korbanos on your private bama, and again, during the time of heter bamais, even the mizbeach was not called mizbeach; it was called a bama gedoyla or bamas tzibur, and the one that you could have built was called either bamas yachid or a bama ketana. Now, after Gilgal, we established ourselves in Shiloh. We were there for 369 years, being that during that time, until the end of the Mishkan, which was connected with the fact that the Aron HaKodesh was removed and tragically captured by the Pelishtim. During those 369 years, we call Mishkan Shiloh a bonified Mishkan. The Mizbeach is not called a Bama Gedoyla, it's called a Mizbeach, and we went back to having the time where it's usher to bring a carbon on a Bama. After the Mishkan of Shiloh was destroyed, dafka because the Aron HaKodesh was captured, for the next 57 years, the Mishkan went first to Noiv and then to Givoim, two locations, totaling 57. During those 57 years, again, it was a zman of heter bamois. That means that a Yid was allowed to bring karbanis on a private bama if they so chose, not any type of carbon. And even in the Mishkan, in Noiv and then in Givoin, we don't call them Mizbeach, we called it a bama gedoyla. From when we moved to Yerushalayim, forever, we may never bring a carbon on a bama. And as we learned together in Shkolim, and then we learned it again in Yuma, because the Aron HaKodesh is properly in its place, whether it's on the external temple, or as King Yoshio hid it in the hidden temple, the Aron HaKodesh is in a halachic Kodesh Kachim, and it's resting in its proper place, and a Yid cannot bring a carbon only in the Makayim where the Mizbeach is meant to be built. Now, can a Jew bring a carbon nowadays, even though there's no temple? Obviously, if one were to build an altar on the proper place on Temple Mount, that is the topic that we'll be discussing. So, let's begin. Says the Mishnah, Ein bein bama gedoyla lebama ketana. That during the times, like we mentioned, where we called the Mizbeach in the Mishkan a bama, and therefore people were allowed to offer, build, if they wanted their own private bama, it's not that you can offer any carbon. The only difference is carbon Pesach. Wow, what does that mean? The only difference is carbon Pesach. So there's a lot which the Mishnah is not writing. So here we go. When a person built a private bama, they were only allowed to offer on that bama ketana or bama yachid a voluntary carbon. They can bring a carbon oila. They can bring a carbon shlomin. Any carbon that's considered obligatory may not be brought on a bama ketana. Now, could you bring it in the mizbeach? Can you bring it on the bama gedola? Can you bring it out on the altar that was standing in the Mishkan compound? So says our Mishnah that even on the bama gedola, you may not bring any obligatory carbon. It has to be a carbon similar to Pesach. What's similar to Pesach? Pesach has two characteristics. Number one, it's considered a carbon tzibur, even though everyone or every group brought their own Pesach, but it's not considered a private carbon. Everyone has to bring it. Number two, Pesach has to be brought at a fixed time, on the 14th in the afternoon. So what is a carbon, for example, similar to Pesach? The daily carbon tamid, the carbon musaf on Shabbos. It's a communal sacrifice that has a fixed time. If there is a carbon that's not communal, or even if it's communal, but if it doesn't have a fixed time, it was not allowed to be brought anywhere. Not only not on the Bama Ketana, not even on the Bama Gedoyla. That's the meaning of the Mishnah. And Zeh HaKlal, Kol Shehu Nidar V'Nidav, any carbon that comes as a voluntary donation, that is allowed to be brought on a Bama, and even on a Bama Ketana. Of course, also on the Bama that was standing in the Mishkan compound. But V'chol She'enoi Loi Nidar V'Loi Nidav, if it wasn't a voluntary sacrifice, if it's in the category of an obligatory sacrifice, as a rule, it cannot be brought on a bama. And again, even on the bama gedoyla, even on bama tzibur, it has to be like the Pesach. That's the Gemara Pesachim v'Sulei. They only brought a Pesach on the bama gedoyla. No, ema ke'ein Pesachim. That's the Rashi. It has to be, number one, communal in nature, and number two, it has to be a communal carbon that has to be brought at a specific time. So the Rashi gives a good example. If the Sanhedrin gave a erroneous ruling regarding a topic for which you're chayiv kares, with all of the details that we will learn in Masechtos Hoydiyos, so there are times that the Sanhedrin has to bring a communal carbon, but there is no time fixed for that carbon to be brought. Such a carbon was not even allowed to be brought on the Bamas Tzibur. Gavaldik. And says our Gemara, our Mishnah follows the Tanach Rab Shimon. The Tanya Rab Shimon Omer Af Tzibur, even on the Bamas Tzibur, and even a communal carbon, Lohi Kriva, was not allowed to be brought on the major Bama. Ela Psachim, only a carbon like a Pesach, which is in the category of a carbon tzibur, which is why it's Doicha Shabbos, and the Choyvos, and any other communal carbon, a tzibur carbon, Shekavu Alehem Zman, that has a time in which it must be brought, the daily tamid, the musaf, any carbon connected to time, and it has to be brought on its moyed. Avol Choyvos she'ein kavu Alehem Zman, like any carbon chatos. Carbon chatos, number one, it's not a tzibur carbon. Number two, there isn't a fixed time. Now, of course, we know that once you designated a carbon, we had that whole sugya that we just quoted recently in the Megila. We had this in Rosh Hashanah. There is a bal ta'acher aspect, but that doesn't mean it has a fixed time. So any chatas, if a person did a sin, then mamish like a Jew in Galus, there was no carbon option to be brought. Not on the major, not on the minor, like karav. Now, during the time where the Mishkan stood in Shiloh, all connected to the Aron HaKodesh being properly resting in its place, that had a status of a real Mishkan. There, the altar was not called a Bama Gedoyla, but it was called a Mizbeach. The advantage of having a Mizbeach is that any type of carbon can be brought on the Mizbeach. And the disadvantage, so to say, is that no carbon can be brought anywhere other than the Mizbeach. It's called the Zman of the Isur Bama. It's the time in where it's Asur, where it's prohibited to build a Bama. Now, how do we compare Shilei to Yerushalayim? So if the Mishkan Shilei was a bona fide Mishkan, is there any difference between the rules that happened during the time that the Mishkan was in Shiloh and later and forever when the Beis HaMikdash is standing in Yerushalayim? So that's the final Ein Bein Shiloh Yerushalayim Elam Shebeshiloh Oichlin Kotche Kalam Umaiser Sheni B'chol Haroya. How beautiful! So there are certain sacrifices or consecrated foods that have to be eaten in the city of Yerushalayim. The city of Yerushalayim always refers to the walled city. And we're going to learn together there are ways of halachically expanding the size of Yerushalayim. It was done various times in the past, but you are bound to eat kache kalim, consecrated meat, or meiser sheni, in the walls of Yerushalayim. Shiloh is not a walled city. So the rule of Shiloh was any physical location from where you can see the Mishkan is like Yerushalayim within the walls. And parenthetically, we learned this together, that all the consecrated foods has a expiration date. You can only eat it for 1 day and 1 night, or for 2 days and 1 night, after which it's called noisar, leftovers that must be burnt. We are today familiar, because of the laws of kashrus, of the concept that if you put hot food in a utensil, the utensil absorbs the taste of the food. Now, you can kasher some materials, you can't kasher earthenware. Which means if earthenware was used to eat kache kalim, by default, after whatever the time would be, those utensils would become not kosher, because it would have the taste of kachim that are expired, absorbed in its walls. What do you do if you have an earthenware utensil that is not kosher? You have to break it. You can't kosher it. So now with excavations, whenever you find shards, broken pieces of earthenware near the temple or near the place of the Mishkan, we know that these were used for the eating of the consecrated foods, and they were broken. They were made into shards for no one to reuse them. So we keep on finding now shards for people who go to Shiloh, as we should all support all the settlements in Shiloh, that mamish, from any location that you can see where the Mishkan stood, we know exactly where the Mishkan stood. You excavate, you're going to find broken shards. Beyond, on the other side of that hill, from the places where you can't physically see the Mishkan, no one was l'chatchila allowed to eat kachim kalim there. No broken shards are found right now. So it has to do with, could you see the Mishkan, can you not see the Mishkan? Ubi Yerushalayim, the rule is lifnim and achayma. It's not about you being able to see the Makim HaMikdash, even if the Yerushalayim is a very hilly city, even if you're living down the hill and you cannot see the place of the temple, as long as you are in the halachic old walls of the city, you can eat kachim kalim and you can eat meiser sheni. And the final line in the Amid, kan v'kan, but in both cases, kachim, the consecrated foods that needs to be eaten already in the holy part of the temple, nachalim, they only may be eaten lifnim and aklayim, within the curtains. The curtains is that which is used in the Mishkan, and later when it came to the building of the Beis HaMikdash, in the place of the curtains we have the walls surrounding the Azara. Kedusha Shiloh, this is the big line over here, Daf Yud, Yesh Achrei Heter, going back to the Bama, even though we had Shiloh, but after Shiloh was destroyed, since for the following 57 years, the Mishkan did not properly house the Aron HaKodesh, so we went back to being allowed to offer certain karbanos on a private Bama. However, the Mishnah appears to be saying that after we built the temple in Yerushalayim, even though tragically there is a Churban for almost 2,000 years, a Jew may never bring a korban in any place other than in the place of the Mizbeach on Temple Mount. Clear from our Mishnah. Now, could you build now a Mizbeach on Temple Mount if you know where the place is, which is another topic? Can you bring a korban? That's going to be the topic that we will be learning on this Amid with the help of God. This Mishnah, which is a Stam Mishnah, says clearly that after the temple was built in Yerushalayim, a Jew may never offer a korban on a platform that was built just for karbanos. You can't do that. I emphasize a Jew because we're going to learn later a Tosfos, I forgot in which Masechta, that clearly writes that Goyim are allowed to offer karbanos on a bama nowadays, but Yidden may not. So now, another quick intro to this Gemara. Mamash at the end of Masechta Menachos. It's a very sad story. Menachos, I think, goes to Daf Kuf Yud or Kuf Yud Aleph and Daf Kuf Tes. Shimon HaTzadik, the great Shimon HaTzadik, we learned about him in Yuma. Right, all of the miracles still happened during his 40 years. He had 2 sons that the Gemara speaks about, Chanioi and Shimi. And there's actually a machlekes to the details of the story, but there was a very tragic story of jealousy between brothers. And Chanioi, who was supposed to be, let's say, the Kohen Gadol, taking over the place of his father, actually needed to run away from Eretz Yisrael. Something very not good happened. And he built a replica of the temple in Alexandria, and there's actually a machloikas whether him needing to escape really pushed him away from the Jewish fold, and he built a replica of the temple to, God forbid, worship idols, or he built a temple to worship God. But he built a bias that's called Beis Chonyoy. Now let's go with the shita that he never left the observance of Yiddishkeit. He built a temple in the service of God, but he built a temple, including a mizbeach. Now, can you now offer a carbon on that mizbeach? So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak said, and we'll see Rabbi Yitzchak retracted, Shamaiti, I heard that after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, no, it's Chanya built it during the times of Bayesheni. But after, now that there's no more a Beis HaMikdash, that you can bring a carbon there. Shemakriven bebeis Chanya bizman hazeh. Wow. Which means, the Gemara says for Rabbi Yitzchak to make that statement, you have to have two rules, based on which you can come to that conclusion. Number one, Kosaver Beis Chonyoy Lav Beis Avodah Zarah, that the narrative, the story that the Gemara in the Nachas has a doubt in, he did not build it to worship idols. He built it to worship God. And number two, still, how can you build a mizbeach in any place other than the temple? It must be that Rabbi Yitzchak is of the opinion, now these are the words, Kedusha Rishoina, the initial sanctification. We are focusing here on the sanctification of the temple. Temple and Yerushalayim go together. The initial sanctification of the temple, Harabais and Yerushalayim, Kitcha L'Shaita. It sanctified it for that era. But it did not imbue those locations with a permanent Kedusha. And during the Churban, since there was a Churban, until the third temple is going to be rebuilt, then since there is no longer a Kedusha, you can go and build and offer karbanos in other locations. Now, it doesn't mean you can only offer a karban in Beis Chonyoy. If you subscribe to the opinion that loy kitchel asad lavai, so then we should go back to the time of Heter Banos and a Chanami. True. Yeah, the Gemara, Rabbi Yitzchak didn't mean to say that you can only offer a carbon in that altar that evidently was still standing after Churban Abayis, but it means you can also offer a carbon over there. And Dichsiv, how do we know that? Because since it says in the Varim and Parshas Re'ei, Kiloi Vasim ad ata, this is Moshe Rabbeinu speaking, that you have not yet come to the place called Menucha, to the place called the resting place, which we'll see refers to Shiloi, and you did not yet come to the Nachla, to our inheritance. And we know Menucha is in reference to Moshe Rabbeinu foreseeing the Mishkan and Shiloi. Nachla, inheritance, is a foresight, is a nevuah regarding the Beis HaMikdash standing in Yerushalayim. And this verse puts them together, so we make a hekish, we juxtapose them, we learn one from the other. In what direction? Makish Nachla leMenucha, to tell us, Ma Menucha yesh achrei heter, just like everyone agrees, that even though there was for 369 years, God came to a Menucha, which was in Shiloi. After it was destroyed, no more Menucha. After it was destroyed, you can build a Mishkan, you can build a Mizbeach, you can build a Bama, anywhere. Af Nachla, even after we came to the Nachla, which is to Yerushalayim, still, Yesh Achrei Heter. So this is what Rabbi Yitzchak said. Again, the big problem is that even though we will see in a moment that there is a Machlokes Tanoim, we're going to learn a Tosfos that's so important, but let's go, we just learned a Mishnah. Our Mishnah clearly says that Ein Bein Shila Yerushalayim, and the Mishnah concluded that after Shiloi Yesh Heter, and after Yerushalayim there is no Heter Bamis. Stam Mishnah asks the Gemara, Amrulei, they asked Rabbi Yitzchak, did you say that? And Amar Lahu, he responded, no, I didn't. Not that I didn't say it. I don't hold by it anymore. I retract my statement. And Rava clarified that. Amar Rava, that when Rabbi Yitzchak said loy, first of all, Rava took an oath. Hu Elokim, by God, Amara. Rabbi Yitzchak said it in the past, and I heard it from him. V'gomin nolominei. Umay tamakahadar bay, when he said no, Rabbi Yitzchak meant I retract. Why do I retract? Because of the question that was posed against this opinion by Reb Mari. What was the question? The Moshe of Reb Mari says in our Mishnah, Stam Mishnah, Kedusha Shilo yesh achrei heter, Kedusha Yerushalayim ein achrei heter. So even if we're going to go by the opinion that Chonyoy ben Shimon HaTzadik built a temple to serve God, it was not permitted, not only not during the times, not permitted with the Mizbeach amongst other issues. If he remembered, you can't make a replica of the temple. There were many issues there. So even if he did it with L'Shem Shamayim, not only Bizman HaBayis, even after Zman HaBayis, you may never offer a korban in any place other than on the Mizbeach, standing exactly the way that Rambam writes, that Makom HaMizbeach Mechuvin B'Yos. Number one. Number two, Tanan have another Mishnah. It says in the Mishnah in Zvachim that Mishabol Yerushalayim, from when we got to Yerushalayim, Nesru HaBamais, from then on, Bamais are prohibited. Mistama the Tosfos that I'm quoting is from Zvachim, V'lo Yehoyelehem Oid Heter, and V'hi Hoysa Nachla. So that's the kasha that was asked on Rabbi Yitzchak. Says the Gemara, really? It's a machlokes tanoim. Really, it's a machlokes tanoim. Now, before we go on, if the Gemara is going to bring now, as we'll see, a Mishnah in Eiduyos, and ultimately we're going to bring a Mishnah in Erechin, and we're going to show that it's a machlokes tanoim, and these are the words. Whether we say on one hand, Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel Shaita Veloy Kitchel Asad Lavai, if it's Veloy Kitchel Asad Lavai, mashma, you can bring a korban on a bama after the Churban Bayesheni until the building of the third temple, or do we say Kedusha Rishayna Kitchel Shaita Vekitchel Asad Lavai? If there's always Kedusha on Harabayis, then you can bring a korban anywhere. If that's the meaning of Tanoi, before we read where do we find that machlokes, then the problem will be, why did Rabbi Yitzchak retract? Why did he retract if it's a machlokes tanoim? And Tosfos therefore has a huge chiddush. The second Tosfos says, let's read it inside. Right, second one, the last wide line before it on top of the Gemara. First of all, on one hand, if not for a machlokes tanoim, how can Rabbi Yitzchak say what he said? But did he not know our Mishnah? Number one. Number two, the answer will be it's a machlokes tanoim. Well, so why did he retract? Indeed, it is a machlokes tanoim. So am I hadarbe? Lema, why doesn't he say? Another Amri, come on, the Amr like Kitcha. And Rab Chaim has a huge chiddush. Rab Chaim Balei Tosfos. V'lochei nira l'harav Rab Chaim. That why did he retract? Listen, even though we're going to learn a machlokes tanoim, everyone holds that Mishaboyel Yerushalayim Nesru Habamis. From when we came to Yerushalayim, a Jew may never offer a korban in any place other than on Temple Mount, exactly on the right location. V'hani Tanoi, the machlokes tanoim is about something else, not whether you can bring a korban on a bama. The machlokes tanoim is, before you build the third temple, can you just build a mizbeach and bring a korban on the mizbeach? Now, if there is no more kedusha of the temple on harabayis, if you don't have the sanctity of the temple, then you can't build a mizbeach. Only if you say Kedusha Rishayna, Kitchel Shaita, V'Kitchel Asid Lavai, then even though there isn't yet a visible, physical third temple, you can build a Mizbeach before the temple is built and offer a korban. V'Hani Tanoy B'Hapligi, the man the Amar Lekitcha, Savar the Af B'Mekoyma Shel Mizbeach, Ein Yechoylem Lahakriv Achshav. Achshav meaning now before the third temple is built. Uman the Amar Kitcha, the one that holds Kitchel Asid Lavai, holds the B'Makoy Mizbeach Mutel Lahakriv. But everyone agrees not on a bama. That's why, even though there's a machlokes tanoim, initially Rabbi Yitzchak felt the machlokes tanoim is whether you can offer it on a bama. Then he retracted because he came to the conclusion that there is no machlokes tanoim. You cannot bring a korban on Beis Chanyoy nor in any other bama built in Israel, built out of Israel. A Jew can only offer a korban on the Mizbeach on Temple Mount. But the question is, can you build only the Mizbeach? Which is such a relevant question, because we have a tradition that either the third temple is going to come down from the heavens, and we'll find out what that means if it's going to happen that way. And if we're going to follow the ruling of the Rambam that we are obligated to build the third temple, but under the leadership of Mashiach, without Mashiach you can't build the third temple. So the temple no one can build right now without Mashiach. Can you build an altar? And that will be predicated on what we're learning. If you say Kedusha Rishayna Kitcha L'Shaita V'Kitcha Le'asid Lavai, which means that you're going to say that right now on Temple Mount, you have the entire Kedusha of the temple, even though the physical temple is not there, then you are allowed to build a Mizbeach if you know exactly where the place of the Mizbeach is. And we're going to come back to this before we close the Sugya, the foundational machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid regarding this topic. But first, let's find the machlokes Tanoi. So let's go inside. Tanoi and the Tanya. And the Tanya is not a Braisa, the Tanya is really a Mishnah. I heard a good word that even though normally you say the Tanya on Braisos, even then there were certain Mishnayos that were not commonly learned, and they were called outside. Eiduyos, like many other Mishnayos on which there is no Gemara, was not commonly learned. So you can also refer to a Mishnah, even though it's in Mishnayos, as a Braisa, as out there. So the Tanya, this is an Eiduyos. Omer Rabbi Eliezer, Shamaiti, I heard that Keshahoyu Boinem Behechal, when we were building the second temple, during the building, it took a while to build it. Oisin koloim lahechal. They made temporary curtains in the place of the walls of the hechal, and they also made temporary curtains in the place where later they built the walls of the azara. And another nuance about those curtains. Ela sheba hechal. When they built the hechal, boinen mibachutz. They built the wall on the outside of the curtain. Chavre haltkop. They built the wall on the outside. That means when the builders were building the wall, they were not standing in the place that became sanctified with the Kedusha of the Azara. Reverence to the Azara. So the curtain was in the innermost boundary of the wall, and they built the wall outside. When the wall was built, they took the curtain down. Uba Azara was the opposite direction. They built it in the inside. In other words, the workers stood in the place that had the Kedusha of the Azara, and in there they built the wall. The curtain was outside the wall. That was Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Yeshua. Now we're going to go with the premise that he's arguing with Rabbi Eliezer, that I heard Shemakriven, that you can offer karbanos even before there was the house was built, even before the entire Beis Hamikdash Bayesheni was built. You can already bring karbanos, and not only that, you can eat kachim, even though there weren't two curtains. You can eat kachim kalim or ma'aser sheni, even though there wasn't a wall around Yerushalayim, as it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Why? Mipnei shekadusha d'shayna, not only kitchel l'shayta, but also kitchel l'asad lavi. So says Rabbi Yeshua. So the premise is that since Rabbi Yeshua is the one that says that, so let's infer that Michlal, that Rabbi Eliezer holds like kitchel l'asad lavi. And that's the reason why Rabbi Eliezer demanded curtains to be hung prior to building the walls. It goes together. Because if you wouldn't have those curtains, if you don't have the temple built, then chaval to wait all that time to build a wall, but you don't have a Beis Hamikdash yet. So they hung the curtains. That's the way initially we understand Rabbi Eliezer to be arguing with Rabbi Yeshua. It's not necessarily pshat. Dilma, the kula alma kedusha l'shoyne kitchel l'shayte v'kitchel asalavai. Everyone subscribes to that. Umar my deshama leika amar, umay my deshama leika amar. Each one is just saying the way things were. And v'chi tema, why was it that way? If, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Kedusha of the temple exists even without the building, why did they have to build curtains? What upside did they get? Rabbi Eliezer, right, koloyim lamali. So the Gemara says, you didn't need it for halachic reasons, only litzniyusa ba'alma, for purposes of privacy. Since that the Kohanim were doing the avodah, you didn't want for everyone to see. It's not nice, it's not private, it's not sanua. So for modesty reasons, they built curtains, but there was no halachic need. So this Braisa, this Mishnah and Eduyos doesn't show you that there was such an argument. Elo ki hane tanoi. We do find the machlokes tanoim. The Tanya Amar Rabbi Shmuel, but Rabbi Yosi. Now this is based on a Mishnah in Erchin, where the Mishnah is enumerating 9 cities that have a wall from the times of Yeshua ben Nun. In the context of people, right, all these halachas that if you consecrated or if you a home, if you sold a home in a walled city with all of the halachas of when may you redeem the home, when will you never be able to redeem the home? It's going to become nechlat. It's going to become property of the buyer, even with a yovel. So the Mishnah enumerates 9 cities, and the Braisa on the Mishnah quotes Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbi Yosi asking, why did they count those 9? And Ashi is really asking, it's not about why we counted those 9. There were many more than 9 cities during the times of Yeshua ben Nun that were walled. Elo answers the Tana that when the Jews under the leadership of Ezra re-entered Israel for the second time, they found those 9, Matzuas Elo, those 9, and Vikichim. But to many cities that were taka-walled from the times of Yeshua ben Nun, Batlu, Misha Batlu Haaretz, they did not reconsecrate it, and they no longer have that sanctity. Now, what's very important is that we were learning until now the topic Kedusha D'Shoina, Kitchela Shaita, yes, Kitchela Asad Lavai, not Kitchela Asad Lavai, in reference to the temple / Yerushalayim. That's one topic. The Gemara now is speaking about another topic, and that is Kedushas Haaretz, the Kedusha for the rest of Israel, which will include whether walled cities, which do have a higher level of Kedusha, whether the walled city status of the times of Yeshua carried automatically over to the times of Ezra and nowadays. That's a separate topic. And the next places that we don't have time to learn makes it very clear that even though our Gemara is understanding that these two are interdependent, clearly our Gemara is based on the premise that if you say that the cities that were walled from the times of Yeshua, if their Kedusha continued throughout, whether we consecrated it or not, the same would hold regarding the temple, or vice versa. We clearly, and Tosfos shows, we don't paskin that they are interdependent. They are dafka different one than the other, and we're going to continue with this on Amid Beis. But our Gemara is linking them. So you see that Kedushas Haaretz, this Tana holds, Rabbi Shmuel, but Rabbi Yossi holds that that's it. They whatever was consecrated during the times of Yeshua, when the Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed the Bayis Rishon and they exiled the Jewish people, all of that Kedusha went away. Alma Kosover Kedusha Rishoina Kitchela Shaita V'loy Kitchela Asalavi. And again, our Gemara is based on the premise, and the same will be according to this Tana regarding the Kedusha of the temple / Yerushalayim. However, what's the contradiction? We're according to Tosefta, also in Erchin, Amar Rabbi Shmuel but Rabbi Yossi. Now the problem is it's the same Tana. Only 9 cities. V'haloi Kfar Nemar, it says in Parshas Devarim that even on the other side of the Jordan River, when the nations that knew that we are coming to conquer their lands, did they fortify their cities? Shishim Ir Kol Chevel Argiv, that Moshe Rabbeinu conquered 60 cities in the entire region of Argiv. And you know what was unique about that area? Uksiv Kol Eila, all of these 60 cities were Arim, were cities that Bitsurois Chayma Gavoya, that they were fortified with high walls. Now, I know that this verse is in reference to cities Transjordan. It doesn't make sense that the cities Transjordan, 60 cities in one area had high walls, and the whole Israel only had 9 cities. No. Ella lama manochachama meselu, says this Tana, Rabbi Shmuel but Rabbi Yossi. It sounds like the same Tana, that Keshaolu b'nei HaGoyla, when the Jewish people entered Israel second time under Ezra, they found the 9 that were enumerated over there in the Mishnah in Erchin, and they consecrated it. One second. Interrupts the Gemara on this Tosefta. No, doesn't mean that. Kitchum, ? Daf Yudam and Beis, or Kitchum Hashta, what they consecrated it now. No, we're going to learn soon in this Tosefta, in a few lines, that the Braisa says they did not need to reconsecrate it. Actually, this Braisa subscribes Kedusha Rishoina Kitchela Shaita V'Kitchela Asalavi. Ella, the second line on Yudam and Beis, Matzo Eli Umenaum. They simply counted it. In other words, there was no need to sanctify it again. Certain cities we don't remember, we lost where they were, and the ones that we remembered that they used to be over here, we put it on record. And therefore the Braisa says it's not only these 9 cities. As long as you have a tradition from your forefathers that these were cities that were Mekafis Yeshua ben Nun, then you should know Kol HaMitzvahs Halalu, the mitzvahs that we're speaking about in Erchin. And by the way, that's going to be connected to, according to our Mishnah, what day do you read the Megila? All of the halach is connected to a walled city. Noisnan ba, Noihagen ba are applied in those cities, whether they have a wall or not. It's irrelevant, because since they had a wall then, and they were imbued with Kedusha then, that Kedusha never left. Now, the problem is that the author of the second Braisa Tosefta is the same Rabbi Shmuel. So Kasha, the Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yishmael. So either today Tanoi, Libid Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi. There are two versions as to what he says, or V'iba Yisema, that the latter Baraisa was said, the Tosefta was said by another Tana. It's really Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi Amara. And here we have another pasuk, the Tanya, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi Amar, when it says Asher loy chayma loy lemetan aleph loy metavav. I think it's Kiri and Ksiv. I don't think it's written with both, but we have a limud that afal pisha ema yachshav ahoy koydem lochein. Even though there isn't one now, it's considered as if it hasn't now. Clearly, Rabbi Elazar, but Rabbi Yossi holds kedusha d'shoyna kitchela shaita v'kitchela asalavi, and therefore it's a machlokes tanoim. And the way Rab Chaim the Rishon learns, no one holds you can bring a carbon on a bama. Question is, can you bring a carbon now on Temple Mount? Now, like we quoted at least by heart from the Tosfos, our Gemara is making these two topics the same, and all of the Rishonim agree that they are not going to be traveling on the same track. Not only don't they have to travel on the same track, but the Poyo Mamish, those who paskent regarding this topic, all of them will go different here than there. Either you're going to follow the Rambam paskens, that Temple Mount, Yerushalayim Ir HaKodesh, the old city, Rambam paskens kedusha d'shoyna kitchela shaita v'kitchela asad lavai. That's why the Rambam writes that if you go on top of Temple Mount, if you don't know where you're walking, if you go into a location which there used to stand the Azara, you're going to be chayiv kares because you're entering the temple betuma. Therefore, Rambam, according to the Rambam, if one were to build a mizbeach knowing that's a big challenge exactly where it stood, you would be allowed and obligated to bring a carbon pesach. The Ravid argues with the Rambam. The Ravid and many others paskin kedusha d'shoyna kitchela shaita v'loy kitchela asad lavi. And like Rab Chaim, not that the Ravid is allowing you to bring a bama. You can't bring a carbon on a bama, even a voluntary carbon. Can't do that. But the Ravid holds that the kedusha of the Beis Hamikdash is no longer there. And the Ravid writes strong words. The Ravid writes something unusual, that this is a secret that was revealed to me with Ruach HaKodesh. He writes it on the Rambam. I think it's in Pedig Vav of Beis Abchira. That it was revealed to me that there isn't the sanctity. How can it be that God would allow for Goyim to be in his sanctuary? The Kedusha left until the third temple is going to be rebuilt. You don't have the Kedusha. It's not that the Ravid allows you to go to Temple Mount. The Ravid says you're not Chayiv Kodesh. Now what's amazing is that both the Rambam and the Ravid flip their opinions regarding the rest of Israel, which is very relevant. In other words, whether there is Kedusha in the rest of Israel affects whether there's a biblical obligation to bring Trumas or Maasros and many other halachas. And the Rambam holds regarding the rest of the Holy Land, Kedusha d'shoyna kitchela shaita v'loy kitchela asad lavi. Rambam. The Ravid and many others who hold that regarding the temple and Yerushalayim, the Kedusha went away, they say the opposite regarding the rest of Eretz Yisrael. And it's important to remember just the Gemara, the basis, that again, our Gemara made these two topics interdependent, but the Rishonim and all the way down to the Poskim, we dafka disentangle, we separate. There are two issues, whether Beis HaMikdash's Kedusha continues, a separate topic, whether the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael continues. Now, also to make it clear, to close this, no one, God forbid, is saying that Eretz Yisrael is not a holy land. It's a holy land forever. It means even if the Kedusha is not as high as it will be, it's still more Kadosh, and there's halachas which are connected to that Kedusha. However, the question is whether the ideal level of Kedusha that was imbued in Israel during the times of Ezra, whether it continues. With many, many more details, you can say that Kedusha, with the Rambam actually holds that the Kedusha of Yehoshua, of Yerushalayim, kitchela shaita, v'loy kitchela asad lavi. But the Kedusha of Ezra, kitchela shaita, v'kitchela asad lavi, Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, let's stop over here. Now we're going to start, again, it's from the two dots, right? We are at the second or third to last narrow lines, all the way to the end of the Perek. We're going to start learning drashas on the Megillah. The Pnei Yeshua, as an intro, we spoke this out in our intro, just to quote it B'Shem Oimroi, based on Dav Zion's statement that Esther was the one who asked for the Chachamim that Kisfuni L'Doiris, which implies that without her ask, Esther would not have been part of Tanach. They were trying later, the Amoraim, to explain why is it part of Nach. Now, why would you think otherwise? Just go with the fact that God's name is not written in it. It's not Matama Yadayim. Even though we actually say it's part of Tanach, it's not Matama Yadayim. When we read the Megillah Esther, we don't have to take precautions not to touch the inside of the cloth, unlike any other of the Sifrei Kodesh that are written properly. But since you have so many different psukim that is written in prior parts of Nach, which allude to the miracle of Esther, that is the way the Pnei Yeshua explains why it was important to show that link. Now, there's a little bit of a weaving back and forth. Keminek HaGemara. We're going to begin expounding actually the words of the Megillah and different events of the Megillah. And after a very short period, we're going to go into which Amoira opened up the Megillah Esther, quoting what source. And then on Daf Yud Aleph, we're going to go back to the further expounding of the words in the Megillah. So let's open up Vayehi b'yamei Achashverosh. And it was in the days of Achashverosh. Amar Rabbi Levi, or V'itema, others say that the following statement was said by Rabbi Yonasan, that Davar Zeh Mesoides B'Yodeinu from the Anshe Knesses HaGdoila, that Kol Makom Shenemar Vayehi, wherever you find the word Vayehi in Scripture, Einoi Elo Lashon Tzad, it's an expression of pain. In other words, you're going to have a painful narrative. And the way in Scripture we introduce a painful narrative is by writing the words Vayehi. And as the Marsha points out, as we will have soon in the Gemara, that Vayehi is a composite of two words. Vai, Vai, whoa. And he is also, we don't say he, for us maybe he is as a laughter expression, but he is another expression that people make when they are mourning. So it's double mourning, Vayehi. And what's the proof? Now, by the way, we're gonna limit this statement. We're not gonna stand with this. We're gonna refute this. But let's begin. Vayehi b'mei Achashverosh, and what happens? Haman. Or in the story of Rus, Vayehi b'mei Shveit HaShoiftim. Start reading, and there was a famine. There was a rav. Let's go to the story of the flood. Vayehi ki heichel ha'adam l'roiv. Oh, the end of Bereshis. Vayar Hashem ki rabba ro'as ha'adam. Another example. It says Vayhi benasa mikedem in the Parshas Noach. Right? They traveled from the east and they come. They're going to make a tower with the whole challenge. Exactly what was wrong with the tower, but it was not a good narrative. Hava nivna lanu ir. Or when it says in Parshas Lech Lecha Vayhi b'mei Amrafel. And what do you have shortly afterwards? The First World War. Also Milchama. When it says Vayhi b'yois Yeshua b'Yerichai, and the failing of not learning Torah at night, and it says afterwards that the angel came, and then the tshuva that we did, the Molchemes Ai, as we just learned, that after a whole day of battle, all of our chayolim spend the whole night learning Torah. Or when it says Vayhi Hashem es Yeshua, and right afterwards it says in that story Vayimu'alu b'nei Yisrael, that we transgressed. Or where it says in the beginning of Shmuel Vayhi ish echad min ha'aramasayim, and what happened? And we record this tragedy in the beginning that Chana was unable to conceive. Even though ki es Chana ohav, yet v'Hashem sagar rachma. Or like it says, Vayehi, really it says Kasher, Zoken Shmuel, but then it says V'lo yholchu banav b'drachav. Shmuel's, even by tzaddikim, sometimes their children don't follow their ways. Where it says Vayehi David l'chol drachav maskil v'Hashem imai. Wow, but then it says, Vayehi Shol Oyein. Look at that word. Oyein means he eyed him. That means he was jealous of David. Or where it says, Vayehi Ki Yoshav HaMelech David B'Veisai. HaMelech goes to David. And then it says that God told David, you're not building the temple. So these are all sources that when you see Vayehi, there is going to be some tragedy right away in the beginning of the narrative. It doesn't mean it's going to end with a tragedy. Many stories had a happy ending, but it's the way Scripture introduces something painful, counters the Gemara. Whoa, it's not so pashut. Frek the Gemara v'haksiv Vayehi b'yoyim hashmini, Parsha Shmini, and v'tanya we learned that Oisa hayoyim Oisa simcha lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that the day that we inaugurated the Mishkan, beginning with the sugya of today, the first Mishkan under Moshe Rabbeinu, we were so joyful to God. Ki yoyim shenivru bo shemayim va'aretz, and the proof is because it says over here Vayehi b'yoyim hashmini, and it says over there Vayehi Vayehi Boiker. So it's good. So the Gemara says that was great, but there was a tragedy. Answers the Gemara, Hashachiv Nadav Avihu. So because of the passing of Nadav and Avihu, that is why it begins Vayehi Yes, Lashon Tzad. We're not done yet. It was in the 480th year from us leaving Mitzrayim. Right? That's when Shlomo HaMelech began to build the first temple. Question number one, nothing painful happened. It's a very happy story. Question number two, Vaksiv, Vayihi Kasher Yaakov is Rachel. When Yaakov met Rachel, what negative was beautiful? Yaakov met Rachel. Nothing tzad happened in the narrative. It says, let's go to creation. Vayerev Boiker Yom Echad. Vayerev Boiker Yom Sheni. Vayerev Yom Shlishi. And there are many other Vayihis that doesn't have any pain written in the narrative. So therefore clarifies, limits, Ella, Amar Ravashi, Kol Vayihi. If you only have the word Vayihi, it can go both ways. Ikahache ve'ikahache. By the way, Vayihi in itself sometimes connotes tzad, but it's not a hard and fast rule. But Vayihi b'yamei, always. Vayihi b'yamei einoi elo lashon tzad. And you know why? Because if you're writing the words b'yamei, think about it, the word Vayihi becomes superfluous. You can begin a story by saying b'yamei. Why do you b'chlal need the word Vayihi? If you're not writing the word b'yamei, Vayihi erev vayiboiker, the word is needed. If the word is extra, then Vayihi is a composite of Vayi and He, which means Lashon Tzad. Now says the Gemara, Chamisha Vayihi b'mei havu. There's only a total of 5 Vayihi b'meis throughout the whole scripture. Vayihi b'mei Achashverosh. Vayihi b'mei Shveit HaShoiftim. We quoted them above. All of them had something painful. Vayihi b'mei Amrafel. Oh, now a new one, Vayihi b'mei Achaz. This is an intro to a terrible civil war. And Vayihi b'mei Yehoyakim, as we'll learn, God willing, at the end of Daf Yud Aleph, this is about the beginning of the first Churban. How ultimately there was a Golus of Yehoyachin, other times called Yechanya, ultimately leading 11 years later to the Churban of the Bayis Rishon. Okay, Ve'amar Rab Levi. That's going to be the hemshech because this was said by Rab Levi, according to the first version at least, that Dover Zem Asoidus B'Yodenu, that Amoitz and Amatzia were brothers. Amos and Amatzia, says Rashi, on this Amud, as you see, as a next daf, you don't have Toisvis, so on the right side, 9 lines before the bottom, Zokt Rashi, Amoitz v'Amatzia. Amoitz was the father of Yeshaya. Remember that the Chapti Gemara. And Amatzia was a Melech Yehuda. And what Rashi doesn't need to say is that Malchei Yehuda were descendants of David HaMelech, David and Shlomo. So Amitz, these two, the father of Yeshaya and the uncle of Yeshaya, which is Amatzia, were brothers. Why was it necessary to remember this fact? Why is it necessary to remember the fact? So the Gemara clarifies why. Okay, the Amar Rab Shmuel Bar Nachmani, right in Soita, Amar Rab Yonasan, that Kol Kala, any daughter-in-law that is modest in the house of her father-in-law, because of her modesty, she will merit and she will give birth to both kings and prophets. And where do we know that from? From Tamar. As it says in Parshas Vayeshev, that Vayireha Yehuda Vayachshevel Lezoina. That when Yehuda saw her at that story, he thought that she was a Zoina. And the Gemara says, and the Pasuk says why? Because she covered her face. Now, you can't read this Pasuk, Kipshutai, because she covered her face. When you travel on the road and you see a woman dressed modesty, so you think, she must be a Zoina. It's the opposite. Ella explains, the Gemara over there in Saita, and we're quoting it here, that because she was so modest in the household of her father-in-law, so Yehuda met her many times, but he never really saw her. Which is why when he saw her now for the first time, because here at this moment she was not dressed modestly, there was a Havamina, she was a Zoina. Because she was modest. Now I know just for my Zayda, they didn't remember his daughter-in-laws. My father had a joke. Every time he would go to visit his father, he would go with my mother and say, Ta, this is my wife, and he would say her name. Because he would make fun of his father that he doesn't know his daughter-in-laws. But I think that was the old Polish Yidden. They made a point not to know. It's not in Metzanua, or however it is. But coming back over here, so she was very modest. And what did she marry? This is Tamar. Now we know that she had Malachim as descendants because the birth of David HaMelech comes from her. So we don't have to prove that she had kings, but which Navi is a descendant from Tamar, and that is why Rab Levi said Amos and Amatzia were brothers. So Malachim we know from David. And Nevi'im, that's it. Amar Rab Levi, that Amos and Amatzia were brothers. And it says, like we just quoted the Nashi, that Yeshayahu Hanavi was the son of Amitz. Amatzia, we just quoted the Nashi, was Melech Yehuda. So now that Amatzia, which is Melech Yehuda, is a descendant of Tamar, so is Yeshayahu. So the Navi that she was rewarded, Tamar, of being Tsanua while she was married to the other sons of Yehuda and she was in the home of Yehuda, was the fact that she ultimately gave birth to Yeshayahu Hanavi. How great is that? And V'amar Rab Levi, another statement, that Davar Zeh Moseiris B'yodeinu Ma'avoseinu. These famous statements, that Makim Orein Einem En Amida, that the Kotche Kotchim took up, there were dimensions. As we know, it was 20 amas by 20 amas. But the place of the Aron HaKodesh, which also took up dimensions, as it says in the Torah, an am and a half by 2 amas and a half, it did not eat up any of the dimensions of the Holy of Holies. So it took up place, but at the same time, the paradox, it took up no space at all. And Tanya Nami Hachi, not only is it an Amoiric statement, but we have this in the Braisa, that Aron Sha'asa Moshe. And by the way, that's Meduyak. We just quoted before the whole sugya in Shkalim, that really there were two Aronis. There was the Aron Sha'asa B'Tzalel, the Aron Sha'asa Moshe. That Aron Sha'asa Moshe, Yesh Lo Eser Amos L'chol Ruach. Eser Amos means that if you were to measure from the edge of the Aron to the end of the room in which it's housed, you would always have 10, no matter which direction you're going to. And it says, now how big was the room? Inside the curtain, which means in the Holy of Holies, you had 20 amas to the length. And it also has, we have another, and we have to add the Maseidas Hashas, and 20 amas to the width. So it's 20 by 20. And it says, Knaf Hakruv Echad, that if you were to measure from the edge of one wing, or the edge of one kruv, Eser Amos, the Knaf Hakruv Ha'achas Eser Amos. So if the whole room has 20 by 20 Amos, and if you are measuring from the outsides, from the periphery, from the edges of the Aron HaKodesh and the Kruvim, until the wall, whichever direction you're going, you only have 10. 10 and 10 is 20. But hold on, the Aron HaKodesh takes up room, whether it's 2.5 amas, whether it's 1.5 amas. So how did that work? So we must say that Aron Gufay Heichal Kai. So where did it stand? Elalav Shmamina, that the Neis Haya Oimed, in other words, the concept of, as we learn in Chasidus, that you have the way God is expressed through the Oid Ein Sof, the way God is expressed through the Tzimtzum. And Atzmus, the source, can combine both together. So space and non-space could coexist. That's the greatest manifestation of the Iker Shechina, which is Atzmus expressed in the physical world. Now we're beginning with how did these Amiroim open up the whole parsha of Megillah Esther. So Rabbi Yonasan, Pasach Le Pischa Lahai Parshasa, his opening lecture on Megillah Esther would be first by quoting a pasuk in Yeshaya, linking the miracle of Esther with a prior part of Scripture, when it says V'kamti Aleim, and ultimately the Babylonians who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, God is going to take retribution from them. V'ichrati leBavel, and I'm going to cut out from the Babylonians their name, Usha'ar and their relatives, V'nin and Nechet, right, their descendants. Nu'um Hashem, says God. So who does that refer to? Shem. God ripped away, took away from the Babylonians their script, in punishment for them destroying the first temple. Sha'ar, what relative did God take away from the Babylonians? Their language. They used to have a script and they used to have a language. Nowadays, there is nothing. Nin goes on the king, the offsprings, goes on the kingdom was taken away from them way before. Already the Madai, as we'll learn, Daryavish Hamadai, right, Belshazzar, who was the grandson of descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, he lost the kingdom, and it went ultimately away from Babel and went to Persia. And V'nechet goes to Vashti, because Vashti was an anicle of Nebuchadnezzar. Rabbi Shmuel ben Amachmeni, Pasach La Pischalai Parsha Mahacha, he would open up his lecture on Megillah Esther by quoting the following pasuk that we say every fast day, Mincha Tachas Anatzutz Yalav V'roish, that God says instead of the thorn will come the cypress tree. Tachas asirpot, right? Instead of the nettle, yalla hadas, a myrtle will come up. Tachas hanatzutz means, instead, who's the natzutz, who's the thorn, Haman Arash? Why is he called a thorn? Because he made himself into an idol. How do we know that? Because it says, amazing. We had the word Nazi before in the prior Masechta. Here, it's a natzutzim means thorns. Upon all of the thorns, and that's all in reference to Avodah Zarah. So Haman, who considered himself to be a deity, he's the natzutz, and in his place, God took him away. And who did he put? Berosh. Now, Berosh means a cypress tree. But why is Mordechay called Berosh? Because Mordechay is the first and the most and the finest of all of the spices. Shenamar, as it says, and this is the Kisisa, when we were commanded one time to make the Shemen HaMishcha, so God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Va'ata kach l'cha psamim roish. I'm sorry, there's Tosfos over here in the bottom. That you should take the finest spices. The first one mentioned is Mordechay. The Targum teaches what's Mordechay. Mari dechi. Mari dechi means pure myrrh. But look at the words. Mari dechi. Put the words together. Mordechay. What's Mordechay is psamim roish. Gavaldik. So that's the pshat. Tachas hanatzutz yalav roish. Tachas asirpot in the place of the nettle. Who is the nettle? Vasti Horisha. Why is she the nettle? Because she was the son of the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar Rasha, which did what? Shesaraf Refidas Beis Hashem. Refidas means the resting place. He destroyed the resting place of God. How do we know that the temple is called the resting place of God? Because it says Refidas Zav. The resting place was made out of gold, as was the first temple. Yalla Hadas, who does the myrtle refer to? As we know, that goes to Esther, and a lot more why Esther is called a Hadas. Hatzadekes, Shenikras Hadasa, as it says in the Megila, Vayihi Oymenas Hadasa. Let's just conclude this pasuk, and then it says in that verse, Vahoya Lashem L'Shem, and it will be to God a name. That refers to Mikra Megillah, and Lo'ois Olam, an everlasting sign, Lo Yikares. These are the Maze of Purim that we already learned. V'zichrem lo Yosef mitoich zaram. That's how we opened up the parsha, and God willing, a lot more to be continued on Daf Yud Aleph.